She hasn't said a word in 2 years. Grace froze, the bread dough cooling in her hands. Across the room, a small girl sat motionless by the window. No hum, no laugh, just silence thick enough to suffocate hope. The man who'd hired her stood in the doorway, arms crossed, jaw tight. Calder Boone, a widower, they'd said in town. A good man gone cold. "You're here to bake," he said, voice flat as the plains outside. "Nothing more, don't speak to her. Don't touch her. Don't even look at her too long." Grace nodded slowly. "I understand." "Do you?" His eyes were hard, unreadable. "Because the last woman I hired thought she could fix things. She couldn't. Nobody can." Grace swallowed. She needed this job. Needed the roof, the wages, the quiet. She'd been running too long to risk losing another chance. "I'm just here to work," she said softly. Calder studied her a moment longer, then turned and walked out. The door swung shut behind him, leaving Grace alone with the silence and the child who carried it. Annie. 4 years old, they'd said, small for her age. Hair the color of wheat, eyes like her father's, gray and guarded. She sat in the corner near the window, knees pulled to her chest, staring at nothing. Grace wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the stone oven. The fire was already crackling, the heat curling into the cool morning air. She set the dough on the wooden counter and began to knead, her movements slow and rhythmic. Outside, the wind stirred the dust. A hawk circled overhead. The ranch stretched endlessly in every direction. Fences, fields, isolation. Grace had known loneliness before, but this was different. This was a house where even the walls seemed to hold their breath. She shaped the dough into a round loaf and set it on the baking stone. As she slid it into the oven, she began to hum, softly, an old lullaby her mother used to sing. She didn't mean to. It just came. And for the first time since she'd arrived, Annie's head turned, just slightly, just enough. Grace's heart skipped, but she didn't look, didn't push. She kept humming, kept working, kept pretending she hadn't noticed. The bread began to bake. The smell of yeast and warmth filled the kitchen. Grace wiped down the counter, checked the fire, glanced at the window. Annie was still watching. Grace smiled to herself. Maybe Calder's rules were meant to protect the girl, or maybe they were meant to protect him. Either way, Grace had learned long ago that some walls were built to be respected, and some were built to fall. She was wiping flour from her hands when the door crashed open. The man who stumbled in reeked of whiskey and rage. His coat was torn, his boots caked in mud. His eyes swept the room and landed on Grace with a sneer. "Where is he?" he snarled. Grace stepped back, pulse spiking. "Who?" "Calder. Where's Calder?" "He's outside." "I don't." 3 months. The man's voice cracked, raw and desperate. 3 months he owes me. Threw me off his land like I was nothing. I worked for him. I bled for him. Grace's throat tightened. "I'm sure if you just talk to him." "Talk?" He laughed bitterly, stumbling forward. "You think talking works with a man like that?" His gaze shifted. "Found Annie." Grace's stomach dropped. "That his girl?" he asked, voice low and dangerous. "Please," Grace whispered. "Just leave. I'll get him. We'll figure this out." But the man was already moving. He crossed the room in 3 strides, grabbed Annie by the arm, and yanked her to her feet. Annie's eyes went wide, silent, terrified. "No!" Grace lunged forward, but the man pulled a knife from his belt, the blade flashing in the firelight. "Back off," he barked, pressing the blade to Annie's side. "You tell Calder, he don't pay. The kid pays." Grace's hands trembled. Her mind raced. Annie's small body was rigid, her mouth open in a soundless scream. "Please," Grace said, voice breaking. "She's just a child. She's sick. She can't even speak." The man hesitated. His grip loosened slightly. Grace took a breath. "Take me instead." The man blinked. "What?" "Take me," Grace repeated, stepping closer. "She's worth nothing to you, but I can work. I can pay his debt. I can." "Grace!" "Don't." But Annie's voice never came. Only silence. The man's eyes narrowed. Then he shoved Annie aside. She hit the floor hard, curling into herself, tears streaming down her face without sound. The man grabbed Grace by the arm, yanked her close, pressed the blade to her throat. "You better be worth it," he hissed. Grace's breath hitched. The edge of the knife bit into her skin. She didn't dare move. And then, a scream. High, piercing, raw. No! Everyone froze. Annie, on the floor. Eyes squeezed shut, fists clenched, screaming. The man's grip faltered. Grace twisted free, stumbling back. The door exploded open. Calder stood in the frame, rifle raised, face carved from stone in fury. "Let her go," he said, voice colder than winter wind. The man backed up, blade still in hand. "She's mine." The gunshot cracked through the air. The man screamed, clutching his shoulder as blood bloomed through his shirt. The knife clattered to the floor. He staggered, cursing, and bolted out the door into the dust. Silence fell again. But this time it was different, because Annie was still crying out loud. Calder dropped to his knees beside her, pulling her into his arms. She buried her face in his chest, her small body shaking with sobs that had been trapped for 2 long years. Grace pressed her back against the wall, her legs threatening to give out. Her hand went to her throat where the blade had been. No blood, just a faint sting. Calder looked up at her. His eyes were raw, unguarded, lost. "You stepped in front of a knife," he said hoarsely. For her. Grace couldn't speak, couldn't explain. She just watched as Annie's tiny hand reached out toward her, trembling. Calder's jaw tightened. He nodded once, then carried his daughter to the corner, holding her close as she wept into his shoulder. Grace slid down the wall and sat on the floor, her hands still shaking. The bread in the oven crackled softly. Outside, the wind picked up, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out. Calder hadn't hired her to save his daughter's life. He'd hired her to bake bread, but in 3 minutes everything had changed. The silence was broken, and so were the rules. The sheriff came at dawn. Calder stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching the dust rise as 2 horses approached. Grace stayed inside, kneading dough with trembling hands. Annie sat at the table, silent again, but her eyes followed Grace's every movement. "You shot a man, Boone," the sheriff said, dismounting. "He had a knife to my daughter's throat," Calder replied evenly. "And to hers." He nodded toward the house. The sheriff glanced at the door. "The new hire?" "Grace Walker. She's been here 3 days. 3 days and already trouble." Calder's jaw tightened. Trouble came looking. She didn't bring it. The sheriff studied him for a long moment. Then he sighed. "Cole Brennan's gone, left town before sunrise. Doc patched his shoulder, said he won't be back. But people are talking, Boone. They're saying you got a woman living here now, alone, with your girl. She's hired help." "That's not what it looks like." Calder's voice dropped, cold and final. "I don't care what it looks like." The sheriff tipped his hat. "Just telling you what I hear. You're a good man, Calder. But this town's got a long memory." He mounted his horse and rode off, leaving only dust and silence. Inside, Grace set the bread on the counter and wiped her hands. Her fingers still shook. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the blade against her throat, heard Annie's scream, saw Calder's face when he burst through the door. "Stay." Grace turned. Annie was standing beside the table, staring at her. The word hung in the air, small and fragile. Grace's throat tightened. "What did you say, sweetheart?" "Stay." Annie's voice cracked. Her eyes filled with tears. "Please stay." Grace knelt down slowly, careful not to startle her. "I'm not going anywhere." "Promise?" Grace's heart broke. "I promise." Annie's lip trembled. Then she took one small step forward, and another, until she was close enough to touch. Grace held perfectly still as the little girl reached out and placed her hand on Grace's cheek. "You saved me," Annie whispered. Grace blinked back tears. "You saved yourself, honey. You found your voice." The door opened. Calder stepped inside, his eyes landing on the 2 of them. He stopped, frozen. Annie's hand was still on Grace's face. Grace looked up at him, and for the first time she saw something other than walls. She saw fear. "I need to talk to you," he said quietly. "Outside." Grace nodded. She gently took Annie's hand and squeezed it. "I'll be right back." Annie didn't let go. "You promised." "I know, and I meant it." Only then did Annie release her. Grace stood and followed Calder out onto the porch. The morning sun was climbing higher now, burning off the last of the cool air. Calder didn't look at her. He stared out at the fields, hands on his hips, shoulders tight. "You should leave," he said. Grace's stomach dropped. "What? This ranch? This town? You should go before it gets worse." "Worse than a knife to my throat?" His jaw worked. "Yes." Grace stepped closer. "I don't understand." "They'll talk," Calder said, voice rough. "The sheriff already said it. A woman living here with me, unmarried, alone. They'll tear you apart. They'll say things, terrible things." "Let them." He finally looked at her. His eyes were hard, guarded. "You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying," Grace said firmly. "I've been torn apart before, Mr. Boone. I've been called worse things than you can imagine, and I'm still standing. This is different." "Why? Because of Annie?" "Because of me." His voice cracked, just slightly. "I can't protect you from this. I can't protect her. I hired you to bake bread, and in 3 days you nearly died." Grace took a breath. "Annie spoke because of me." "I know. She touched me. She asked me to stay." "I know." His hands clenched into fists. "And that's why you should go. Before she gets more attached. Before this becomes something I can't fix." Grace felt anger rising in her chest. "You think leaving will fix her? You think silence is better than this?" "I think safety is better than risk. She was safe before I came." Grace shot back. "And she was dying inside." The words hung between them, raw and true. Calder turned away, his breathing heavy. "You don't understand." "Then help me understand." He was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "My wife died 2 years ago. Fever took her in 3 days. Annie was there. She watched her mother burn up from the inside, watched her stop breathing, and the last thing my wife said was Annie's name." He swallowed hard. "Annie hasn't spoken since. Not a word, not a sound, until yesterday." Grace's anger faded. "I'm sorry. I've tried everything," Calder continued. "Doctors, preachers, kind women from town. Nothing worked. I thought if I kept her safe, kept her quiet, maybe she'd heal on her own, but she didn't." He looked at Grace, and his eyes were wet. "Then you show up, and in 3 days, you do what I couldn't do in 2 years. That's not true." "It is." His voice broke. "She spoke for you, not for me." Grace stepped forward. Her voice soft but firm. "She spoke because she was scared. She spoke because someone she cared about was in danger. That's not magic, Mr. Bone. That's love." Calder looked at her, stunned. "And if she can love me in 3 days," Grace said quietly, "imagine what she feels for you." He turned away again, his shoulders shaking. Grace wanted to reach out to comfort him, but she didn't. Some walls had to fall on their own. After a long moment, Calder wiped his face with the back of his hand. "If you stay, people will talk. Let them. They'll call you names. I've heard worse. They'll say you're trying to replace her mother." Grace's voice was steady. "I'm not trying to replace anyone. I'm just trying to help." Calder looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded. "Just once. All right. You can stay. But we do this right. You work. You bake. You keep your distance. And when the town asks, you tell them you're hired help. Nothing more. Understood? And if it gets too hard, it won't." He studied her, searching for doubt. He didn't find any. "You're stubborn," he said. "So are you?" The corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Fair enough." They stood there for a moment, the morning sun warming the porch, the smell of fresh bread drifting from the kitchen. Inside, Annie was humming, softly, hesitantly, but humming. Grace's chest tightened. She glanced at Calder. He'd heard it too. His eyes were wide, disbelieving. "She's humming," Grace whispered. Calder nodded, unable to speak. Grace turned toward the door, but Calder's voice stopped her. "Miss Walker." She looked back. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for staying." Grace smiled. "Thank you for letting me." She went inside, leaving him alone on the porch. Calder stood there for a long time, listening to his daughter's voice. It was small, fragile, but it was there. And for the first time in 2 years he let himself hope. But hope, he knew, was a dangerous thing, especially when the town was watching. The town came on Sunday. Grace was pulling fresh loaves from the oven when she heard the wagons, 3 of them rolling up the long dirt road. She stepped to the window. Calder was already outside, standing like a wall. "Stay inside," he called. Annie clutched Grace's dress. "It's all right," Grace whispered. "Your papa's got this." The wagon stopped. Mrs. Pritchard stepped down first, stern-faced in Sunday black. Behind her came 2 more women and a man. "Calder Boone," Mrs. Pritchard said sharply. "We need to speak with you." "Then speak," Calder replied. "Not out here. Inside. With her." Calder didn't move. "Miss Walker is working. This is about the welfare of your daughter." Mrs. Pritchard's eyes found Grace in the window. "Word is she spoke for the first time in 2 years. After a strange woman moved in. She's hired help." "Hired help doesn't live under your roof, Calder. Not unmarried." Mrs. Pritchard's voice rose. "She's a scandal." Grace felt Annie trembling. "I'm going out there," Grace said quietly. "No," Annie whispered. "Don't." "I have to, sweetheart." Grace walked outside and stopped before Mrs. Pritchard. "You wanted to speak with me?" The woman looked her up and down. "Grace Walker, where are you from?" "Kansas." "And before that?" Grace hesitated. Just for a second. Mrs. Pritchard smiled coldly. "Running from something?" "No, ma'am. Just looking for work." "Work." The word dripped disdain. "You're an unmarried woman living alone with a widower and his child." "I have a room. I work for wages. There's nothing improper." "I would have you leave entirely." Grace stood firm. "That's not your decision. You've bewitched that child," Mrs. Pritchard snapped, turned her against her own father. "I've done no such thing." "Then why does she cling to you?" "Because I listen." Grace's voice cracked. "Because I don't treat her like she's broken. Because I let her be a child instead of a ghost." The silence was deafening. Grace stepped closer, trembling with anger. "Where were you 2 years ago? When Calder was drowning in grief and Annie was crying herself to sleep? You brought casseroles and prayers and left. You didn't stay. You didn't try." Mrs. Pritchard's mouth opened. No words came. "I'm not trying to replace her mother," Grace said fiercely. "I'm just trying to help a little girl find her voice. And if that offends you, I won't apologize for caring." The wind stirred. Then from the porch, a small voice rang out. "She's my friend." Everyone turned. Annie stood on the top step, fists balled, face determined. "She's my friend," Annie repeated louder. Her voice shook but didn't break. "And she's good. And she makes bread. And she sings. And she doesn't yell at me. She just loves me." Grace's throat closed. Annie looked at Mrs. Pritchard. "You're mean, and I don't want you here." The woman went pale. "This is unacceptable." "No," Calder said quietly, walking to stand beside Annie. "What's unacceptable is you attacking the one person who brought my daughter back to life." He placed a hand on Annie's shoulder. "Miss Walker stays. If you don't like it, leave." Mrs. Pritchard turned sharply. "You'll regret this, Boone." "Maybe, but not today." Within moments, they were gone. Grace stood trembling. Annie ran down the steps straight into her arms. "You're so brave," Grace whispered. So brave." "I didn't want them to take you." "They won't. I'm not going anywhere." Calder walked down slowly. "Thank you for defending her, for defending us." Grace looked up, still holding Annie. "I meant every word." He nodded. Then hesitantly he placed a hand on Annie's back. His fingers brushed Grace's arm. Brief, but there. "Come inside," he said. "Both of you." They walked back together. For the first time it felt like more than a job. It felt like home. But outside the dust settled, and in town whispers were just beginning. 2 weeks passed. The town stayed away, but the silence was worse than the whispers. No one came to buy bread. No one stopped by the ranch. Even the traveling merchant who usually brought supplies skipped their road entirely. Grace noticed. So did Calder. "We can go into town ourselves," he said one morning, hitching the wagon. "Get what we need and get out." Grace wiped flour from her hands. "You sure that's wise?" "We need supplies. I'm not letting them starve us out." Annie climbed into the wagon without being asked. She sat between them, her small hand finding Grace's. Grace squeezed back, trying to ignore the knot in her stomach. The ride into town was quiet, too quiet. Even the birds seemed to sense the tension. When they rolled down Main Street, heads turned, conversations stopped. Women pulled their children closer, men stared from storefronts, jaws tight, eyes cold. Calder pulled the wagon to a stop outside the general store. "Stay here," he told Grace. "No." Grace climbed down, lifting Annie after her. "We're in this together." Calder looked like he wanted to argue, but Annie was already holding Grace's hand, and the determination in both their faces left no room for debate. They walked into the store as one. The shopkeeper, Mr. Dalton, looked up from his counter. His expression soured immediately. "Calder." "Dalton." Calder nodded. "Need flour, sugar, salt, the usual." The man didn't move. "Afraid I can't help you." "Excuse me?" "I said I can't help you." Dalton crossed his arms. "Store policy. We don't serve folks who bring shame on this town." Grace felt the heat rise in her chest. "Shame?" "You heard me." Dalton's eyes were hard. "You want supplies, go somewhere else." "There is nowhere else," Calder said evenly. "This is the only store for 20 miles. Then I guess you'll have to make do." Calder's fists clenched. Grace put a hand on his arm, stopping him. "We'll manage," she said quietly. "Let's go." But Annie didn't move. She stared at Mr. Dalton, her face pale, her lip trembling. "Come on, sweetheart," Grace urged gently. "No." Annie's voice was small but firm. "Annie." "No." Louder this time. Annie pulled away from Grace and stepped toward the counter. Her small body was shaking, but her eyes were fierce. "You're mean, just like the others. My papa works hard. Miss Grace works hard. And you won't even sell us flour?" Dalton's face reddened. "Little girl, this is grown-up business." "I'm not little," Annie shouted. Tears streamed down her face, but her voice didn't break. "I'm 4, and I know mean when I see it. And you're mean." The store went silent. 2 other customers stood frozen near the shelves, staring. Grace knelt beside Annie, trying to soothe her. "It's okay, honey. It's not okay." Annie turned to her, sobbing. "They hate us. They hate you, and I don't understand why." Grace's heart shattered. She pulled Annie into her arms, holding her as the little girl cried. Over Annie's head, Grace looked at Dalton. "She's a child. You're breaking her heart over pride." "It's not pride," Dalton said stiffly. "It's morals." "Morals?" Grace's voice turned cold. "What's moral about punishing a little girl for something she didn't do? She's not being punished. You are. And she suffers for it. Does that make you feel righteous?" Dalton looked away, his jaw tight, but he didn't budge. Calder stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. "I've lived in this town my whole life. I've paid my taxes, helped my neighbors, buried my wife in your churchyard. And this is how you repay me. You brought this on yourself, Boone. By hiring help? By letting that woman live under your roof. Her name is Grace," Calder said through gritted teeth, "and she saved my daughter's life." "So you say." "So I know." Calder's voice rose. "My daughter was silent for 2 years. 2 years, Dalton, you saw it. The whole town saw it, and you did nothing. But Grace came, and in 3 days Annie spoke again. In 2 weeks, she's laughing, singing, living, and you want to punish us for that?" Dalton's face was stone. "The rules are the rules." "Then your rules are wrong." The words echoed in the small store. One of the customers, an older man near the back, cleared his throat. "He's got a point, Dalton." Dalton spun. "Stay out of this, Carl." "I'm just saying," Carl continued, stepping forward. "I remember when Annie stopped talking. Broke my heart. If this woman brought her back," he shrugged. "Maybe we're being too hard on them." "It's improper," Dalton insisted. "So was my first marriage," Carl said dryly. "But I still got flour when I needed it." A few people chuckled. Dalton's face turned red. But before he could respond, the door burst open. Mrs. Pritchard stormed in, flanked by 2 other women. Her eyes locked on Grace immediately. "I knew you'd come crawling back." Grace stood, still holding Annie. "We're just trying to buy supplies. And spreading your poison while you're at it." "I see." Mrs. Pritchard's voice was venomous. "Turning this child into a weapon against decent people." "She's not a weapon," Grace said quietly. "She's a little girl. A little girl you've corrupted." "Corrupted?" Grace's voice shook with anger. I taught her to speak. I taught her to trust. I taught her that kindness exists. If that's corruption, then I'm guilty. You taught her to defy her elders, to disrespect authority. I taught her to stand up for herself. Grace's eyes blazed. Something you clearly never learned. Mrs. Pritchard's hand flew up, aiming for Grace's face. Calder caught her wrist mid-swing. His grip was iron. Don't. The woman gasped, trying to pull away. Let go of me. Touch her again, Calder said, his voice colder than winter wind, and you'll regret it. You're threatening me? I'm protecting what's mine. The words hung in the air. Heavy, final. Mrs. Pritchard wrenched her hand free, her face twisted with fury. You've made your choice, Boone, and you'll live with the consequences. She stormed out, her entourage following. Grace stood frozen, her heart pounding. Calder turned to her, his expression unreadable. You all right? She nodded, unable to speak. Annie tugged on Calder's sleeve. Papa, what did you mean? What's yours? Calder's face softened. He knelt down, eye level with his daughter. I meant you and Miss Grace. You're both mine to protect. Annie's eyes widened. Miss Grace too? Calder hesitated, then nodded. Yes, Miss Grace too. Annie smiled through her tears. Good, because I love her. Calder's throat worked. He looked at Grace, and for the first time she saw something raw in his eyes, something vulnerable. So do I, he whispered. Grace's breath caught. The store fell silent again, but this time it wasn't hostile, it was stunned. Carl cleared his throat, breaking the moment. Well, I'll be damned. Dalton stood behind the counter, mouth open, at a complete loss. Calder stood, pulling Annie up with him. He looked at Dalton. Last chance. Are you going to sell us supplies or not? Dalton stared at him. Then slowly he reached under the counter and pulled out a sack of flour. Fine. But this doesn't change anything. Yes, Calder said. It does. He paid, loaded the supplies, and led Grace and Annie outside. The wagon rolled out of town in silence, but this time it felt different. Grace sat beside Calder, Annie between them, and for the first time in years she felt something she thought she'd lost. She felt safe. But as the town faded behind them, neither of them saw the shadow that followed, a figure on horseback watching from the hills. Waiting. The fire started just after midnight. Grace woke to smoke. She bolted upright, heart hammering. Orange light flickered through her window, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The barn was burning. She ran to Annie's room, grabbed the sleeping girl, and rushed outside. Calder was already there, boots half-laced, staring at the inferno. Flames reached toward the sky like hungry fingers. Get back, he shouted over the roar. But Grace saw him, the shadow in the firelight. Watching, Cole Brennan. He stepped forward, arms still in a sling, face twisted with rage and satisfaction. His clothes were torn, his eyes wild. Told you there'd be consequences, Boone, he said, his voice rough. Calder's fists clenched. You did this. Damn right. Cole spat into the dirt. You shot me, threw me out like trash. Chose her over loyalty. Leave. Now. Cole pulled a revolver from his belt, the metal gleaming in the firelight. Not until I take what's mine. He aimed it at Grace. Calder lunged. The gun fired, the shot cracking through the night. Grace screamed, pulling Annie close. The bullet hit dirt, kicking up dust. They wrestled, rolling in the dust, bodies tangled, grunting with effort. The gun fired again, wild, the bullet disappearing into darkness. Grace set Annie behind a water trough. Stay down. She grabbed a shovel leaning against the fence and swung hard, catching Cole in the ribs with a sickening thud. He howled, dropping the gun. Calder seized it, rolled clear, and came up, aiming at Cole's chest. It's over, Calder said, breathing hard. Cole collapsed, groaning and clutching his side. Blood seeped through his shirt from the reopened wound. Behind them the barn fell with a thunderous crash, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. Grace ran to Annie, holding her tight. We're okay. It's over. Dawn came slowly. The sheriff arrived with 2 deputies, took one look at Cole lying in the dirt and nodded grimly. Arson and attempted murder. He's done. Won't see freedom for years. They loaded him into a wagon. Cole didn't resist, too weak and defeated. As the wagon rolled away, Grace finally exhaled. Calder walked to Grace, his face smoke-stained and exhausted, but his eyes were clear. "You hit him with a shovel." She laughed weakly. "I did. You could have died. So could you." He touched her face gently. "I meant what I said in town. I love you." Her breath caught. "I love you too." Annie looked up at them with wide, hopeful eyes. "Does Grace stay forever now?" Calder smiled, tears gathering. "If she'll have us." "Yes," Grace whispered. "Always." He kissed her softly. Annie squealed, hugging them both tight. 3 months later, they married in the small church at the edge of town. Few attended, Carl from the store. A handful of neighbors. Mrs. Pritchard stayed away, as did most of the town. Grace didn't care. She stood beside Calder in a simple cream dress, holding Annie's hand, and spoke her vows with a full heart. "I promise to bake your bread, mend your fences, and love your daughter as my own." Calder's voice was steady and strong. "I promise to protect you, honor you, and never let you face the world alone." Annie tugged Grace's dress. "Can I say something?" The pastor nodded, smiling. "Thank you for staying," Annie said, her voice clear. "And for loving us, and for teaching me it's okay to talk again." Grace knelt, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for letting me." That evening they sat on the porch together. The new barn stood tall against the sunset. Annie slept between them, her head on Grace's lap. "Do you ever regret staying?" Calder asked quietly. Grace looked at him, at Annie, at their home. "Never." He squeezed her hand. "Good, because I don't know what I'd do without you." The sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. A hawk called overhead, its cry echoing across the plains. Grace felt peace wash over her. She'd come to bake bread, to survive, to escape a past that haunted her. But she'd found a silent voice that needed to sing, a closed heart that needed to open, a broken family that needed to heal. And in healing them, she'd healed herself. "I love you, Grace Walker Boone," Calder whispered. "I love you too." Annie mumbled about bread and honey in her sleep, her small hand clutching Grace's fingers. The danger was gone. The silence was broken. The story was complete. But it wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. Grace had arrived at this ranch carrying nothing but flour-dusted hands and a wounded past. She'd faced knives, fire, and judgment. And she'd won. Not because she fought harder, but because she loved deeper. The town would always whisper. Mrs. Pritchard would always disapprove. But here, on this porch, with Calder's hand in hers and Annie's soft breathing between them, none of that mattered. This was home. This was family. This was everything. Calder pulled her close, his arm warm around her shoulders. "What are you thinking?" Grace smiled. "That I'd do it all again. Even the knife. Even the knife. Even the fire. Even the fire." He kissed her forehead tenderly. "You're stubborn. So are you." Annie stirred, opening sleepy eyes. "Are you two talking about love again?" They laughed. Grace brushed hair from Annie's face. "Maybe." "Good," Annie said seriously. "Because I love you both very much, more than anything." "We love you too, sweetheart," Grace said, her heart full. Annie yawned. "Can we have cinnamon bread tomorrow?" "Of course." "With honey?" "With lots of honey." Satisfied, Annie closed her eyes again, a small smile on her lips. Calder watched his daughter, his expression soft with wonder. Then he turned to Grace. "She's different now, because of you. She was always strong. She just needed permission to show it." "So did I," he admitted quietly. Grace leaned against him, fitting perfectly into his side. They sat in comfortable silence as stars appeared, one by one, in the darkening sky. The ranch was quiet, peaceful, safe. No more shadows in the hills, no more danger at the door. Just a man, a woman, and a little girl who'd found each other in the broken places. And somehow together they'd become whole. "Grace," Calder's voice was soft. "Yes? Thank you." "For what?" "For not giving up. On her, on me, on us." Grace smiled, pressing closer. "I couldn't. You're mine now. And you're ours." The wind whispered through the fields, carrying the scent of earth and growing things. The hawk's cry faded into night, replaced by the gentle chorus of crickets. and on the porch of a ranch in the middle of nowhere, a family sat together, not bound by blood, but by something stronger. Love, choice, hope. Grace closed her eyes, breathing in the cool night air. Tomorrow she'd bake bread, mend fences, teach Annie her letters, help Calder with the horses. Tomorrow life would continue. But tonight, in this perfect moment, she simply held on to what mattered most. Her husband's hand, her daughter's warmth, her home's heartbeat. "I'm glad I stayed," she whispered into the darkness. Calder kissed her hair. "So am I, more than you'll ever know." And somewhere above, the stars burned brighter, watching over a family that had found its way home. And the end. If this story of survival, courage, and unexpected love touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe to Wild West Untold Love for more tales of redemption on the frontier. And if a moment or a feeling in this story stayed with you, we'd love to hear it in the comments below. Because sometimes the strongest souls are forged in the darkest places, and the greatest love stories begin with the simplest act of kindness.